Good afternoon. We're going on now to deal with the 7 churches. And these texts, these are all within Turkey, what is now modern Turkey. We'll deal with how that structure came to be and the significance of their appearance in Revelation chapters 2 and 3. These churches are very significant, and they represent not just tiny locations, some of which have no occupants now at all in the areas where they existed, but they are expected, and they're depicted in prophecy as some being no longer extant, but others being alive at the time of the return of the Messiah. Now, all of that is very important. What we're going to do is we'll deal with how we got into these areas of the 7 churches. How that occurred in the first place follows on from prophecy itself. There was no sign to be given to the church except for the sign of Jonah. And that sign was to carry through on an extended basis through to the return of the Messiah. Now, there is a film, a video on the sign of Jonah and the history of the reconstruction of the temple, which you should look at, because as it's the only sign given to the church, it's extremely important that you understand what it means. There were some forgeries in the King James Version of the Bible which altered the structure of understanding of the book of Daniel in chapter 9 at verse 25. The forgeries there disguised the real intent. If the church in Jerusalem had have had the King James Version of the Bible, they'd all be dead, because they wouldn't have understood that they had to get out of the place. Now, it related to the 70 weeks of years, and the 70 weeks of years didn't relate to the coming of the Messiah. It related to 2 ordained Messiahs. One was after 7 weeks of years, and that related to Nehemiah, governor of Judah, and the second one related to the brother of the Christ, James. And of course, the Mariolators don't want to pretend that Christ didn't have any brothers and that Mary remained a virgin, her name wasn't Mary, and she didn't remain a virgin. She had further children and to Joseph, and she was taken by John when he was given responsibility for her at the crucifixion, that is, when Christ was killed on the Stauros. Christ said to John, "This is your mother," and he put her into John's care. Now, John took that seriously all his life, and he took Mariam to Ephesus with him. James was killed in the year 63 CE, and they then passed responsibility for the bishopric of the church at Jerusalem to Miriam's brother-in-law, Clopas, and he became bishop, but he died that year. And then his son Simon, or Simeon, became bishop, and they then took the church to Pella. They stayed at Pella for a while, but they didn't stay there permanently. The church established itself at Ephesus, and ultimately they all relocated to Ephesus. When Christ ordained the 70 in Luke 10 verses 1 and 17, we see them referred to, They were sent out 2 by 2, and then they came back and found that the demons were subject to them, and that they had power, and that they were able to deal with the world and its people. Those 70 were spread throughout the world into the various churches. That's covered in number 122D, which deals with the locations to which they were all sent and what happened to them. All of that is very important in locating where the churches were, how they were established, who went where, what happened to the apostles, and what happened to each of the 70. Many of them were martyred. Many of them lived long ages. They went on dealing with the church system as it then developed in the different locations of the world. Now, John was at Ephesus, and the church relocated from Jerusalem and Galilee to Ephesus. Now, all of that is covered in the extensive videos we've made of Ephesus, and in the galleries and the museums, and the videos of the different types of artifacts that have been recovered and are available to show you what life was like at that time. We've made films about each one of these 7 churches. We start with Constantinople, which is now Istanbul, and we deal with the artifacts and church groups and constructions in Istanbul, dealing with the early phases. We then produce a secondary video on Troy in their move back to the 7 churches, and then we go through Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamos, Thyatira, and then we talk about Philadelphia and Sardis and Laodicea. And we have a number of videos on each of those locations and a few other things of interest, such as Colossae and other areas. But we will explain each of those areas in sequence. But in dealing with the importance of these churches, they're not just relics or archaeological ruins in Turkey that we're talking about. We're talking about eras of the church over 2,000 years. Now, the Trinitarian system cannot afford to deal with this as prophecy and the concept that they are eras, because the Roman Catholic Church is trying to establish the fact that it really is the historical church, and that there is only one church, and if you're not a Trinitarian from Rome, you're not really a Christian anyway. And all that nonsense requires them to deny prophecy and deny the place of the eras of the church and the place and function of the church and the prophecy of God in Revelation through chapters 2 and 3 and onwards, because they can't afford to face the fact that it is them that is the whore, and their harlot daughters, her harlot daughters, are the Trinitarian churches around the world who have split off from them, the Protestants of all descriptions. That is the section that is being dealt with in the book of Revelation, and we will be going through those systems also. What's important to note is that the people who were in Jerusalem and Galilee who knew the Christ, moved with John to Ephesus. Now we know all of this because there was a young chap there by the name of Irenaeus. He sat at the feet of John, and he knew John and the elders of the church, the people who were by that time quite old, but who were there and knew the Christ. So he discussed the Christ and what was taught, and he was first-hand aware from the mouth of John and the people who knew the Christ what the doctrines of the church were. That's why Irenaeus is important. He was then trained by Polycarp, who was the bishop at Smyrna. And that Ephesian system was the first church, the first love of the church. Smyrna was the second. Smyrna means bitter, and it was bitter in the early persecution by the Romans of the Church of God. And it was Polycarp that had to deal with Anicetus and the Quartodeciban disputes when Anicetus at Rome in 154 introduced the pagan Easter system from the worship of the god Attis in Rome. Polycarp had to deal with him, and then he was trained. Polycarp was trained at Smyrna when he was bishop. He was trained also by John, and he became bishop at Smyrna from the teachings of the Apostle John, and he was 100% apostolic in his teachings. He also trained Polycrates, whom he succeeded him as bishop at Smyrna, and then he established the church onwards through from Smyrna, dealing with all the people in the church as far away as Lyon in Gaul and in Britain. The British church was independent of them all because it had been established by Aristobulus on land given to Linus by Arviragus, his uncle, for the establishment of the first church in Britain at Gloucester. All of these things are very important for you to understand. That was still, even though they're independent, was still part of the Smyrna era. That resulted the heresy of Victor in enforcing the Easter system in Rome and requiring for you to be in communion with Rome, you had to adopt and keep the Easter system. That is, a Friday crucifixion and a Sunday resurrection, which is absolute fiction, lies. Christ was killed on Wednesday, the 5th of April, 30 CE, and he was resurrected at the end of the Sabbath and the beginning of the night of Sunday. All of that is important that we understand these eras, what they were, what their governments were, what sort of doctrines they had, and how there was a continuity in the church through its baptismal process for 2,000 years. And that continuity has never been broken. Even though false prophets in Sardis entered, the baptismal system was maintained, and the lampstand was passed through that system so that they were operational and able to perform while they were keeping the correct doctrines. And there were many problems in the last 200 years arising out of North America in the churches of God over the Sardis and Laodicean systems. We understand in these texts we have in 170, which is the role of the fourth commandment in the historical Sabbath-keeping churches of God, takes you through these eras, what happened at Ephesus and Smyrna, and then what happened in the Pergamus era, why it was warlike and how it, for survival, resisted. The Paulicians resisted the Byzantine structure, and the system of Islam was part of the Paulician era, and then it was undermined and destroyed by the areas of the Abbasids, and how the Abbasids took over from the rightly guided caliphs, the Rashidun caliphs. And then the revolution in 751 changed the structure of the Islamic and the Paulicians, where the Paulicians then carried through into the European structure of the Thyatirians. Now, all of those are there so that we understand the Thyatirians did most of the heavy lifting for the churches of God right through until last century. That is, until the end of the 18th century, in the 1900s through to 1894. The history was written by Rabbi Cohn and the Sabbatarians in Siebenbürgen. That is, the Sabbatarians in Transylvania, which is the way it's rendered in the English from the German. All of these areas and the sequence of the prophecies is very important. You'll see in all of these visions the actual locations of the church, and each of those church areas, and there are also things on Constantinople, as we said, the Istanbul photos, the Hagia Sophia, and there are also the various other locations in Turkey which show quite some significant historical significance and quite some impact on the areas of the operations of the church. These structures, as we go into the last days, and we have to deal with there are only four, from prophecy, there are only four of those churches still operational in the last days. A remnant of Thyatira, which is in Europe. There's the Sardis system, the Laodicean system, and the Philadelphian system. Who they are is critical to all of you. But where they also came from in Turkey is of historical significance. But they are eras, not locations and places. But it's important that you see what the original things were, and you see the photos of, for instance, the Pillars of Philadelphia, which is referred to in prophecy in Revelation chapter 3, verses 7 to 13. Those things actually do exist. And we'll see each one of those sequences, and it will tell us and give us a mental picture of the things that were there and why. For instance, the Laodiceans were described as lukewarm because of their water system, and we've taken some videos of actually what was involved in the water and what it meant that the waters were lukewarm there in Laodicea. Because we went there when they started to dig it up, and we did quite some work there. It's more extensively excavated now, but we were there in the early stages when they were digging it up, and I think that's quite important. And you'll get a lot out of all of these all of these videos as we go through them. And we'll deal with sections of the churches as we go with the videos. So you'll have the video will be split up into different sequences and sections with different comments preceding and succeeding them.